Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and I'm going to talk about everything that has changed with the new edition when it comes to death. Now, specifically, I'm looking at the compendium profile changes, all the free PDFs that GW has incredibly allowed us to take a look at. And we've got a bunch of these videos in this series, so I'm just going to get right into it. First off, with death, I want to talk about the Thralls. Now, in new matched play rules, you can bring 3 Thralls, and they've clearly taken that into account when adjusting the points of Direwolves and Fell Bars. Fell Bats went up from 110 to 130 points. Direwolves went from 70 to 85 points. They stayed the same. To be honest, both of these needed the nerf. Both were too good in their first iteration. They also got rid of regular bat swarms, so like if you see the picture I've shown here, the big one is the fell bat and the 2 little ones are the bat swarms. They come in one package together. I guess now you can just play the bat swarms as another fell bat, and I'm sure that'll be fine, right? Direwolves still have their bonus move, so they're still good. I'd probably, if I was getting really competitive, I'd probably play a Direwolf before I played a Chain Rasp. I wouldn't want to spam Direwolf, like I wouldn't go to all 3 probably, just because you're only going to use that bonus move on one of them probably. But the first Direwolf, I'd probably play that before I'd play my first Chain Rasp. Any kind of faction with really bad chaff is going to be interested in these wolves. Then Fellbats. Fellbats have a totally different role, right? They're basically like trying to be a little cheat code in hunter missions. I think at 110 points that was true. At 130, I think they're much less of a cheat code, but they've still got their bonus attack. They're still pretty good. Absolutely something that you can pretty strongly consider playing in your lists for hunting down treasure carriers, etc. So let's go into our first faction, which is going to be Nighthaunt. Nighthaunt's reaction is called Flickering Form. When an enemy fighter finishes a move action within 3 inches, note the distance between. Teleport onto a platform or floor no further than the previous distance that you noted. K-Knight Shadowstalkers, I think, have something very similar. Note here, though, with this Nighthaunt one, it doesn't say visible in the rules text. So if someone if you're on one side of a wall and they move to the other side of the wall, you can actually just teleport into combat now with the wall not in between you, which could be something you want to do. Also, you can teleport onto an objective. So, for example, you used to be able to, in first edition, you could move while base to base with someone, so you could swing around their base to be counting on an objective and then attack them, if that was going to be more valuable to you than 2 attacks would be. And Nighthaunt a lot of them have pretty low damage, so that'll often be true. Well, this is great because it lets you have to decide immediately when they make their move, but it basically lets you make that move that is no longer in the game, that a lot of good players were using specifically on objective missions, but you could do it to like grab a treasure too. If you had I don't know, if there was some reason someone had moved near you but not onto a treasure, you could get to a treasure, something like that. So there's kind of some tricksiness you can do. You can also teleport out of combat with a given model here. Now this is not going to come up a ton, but it will sometimes. And it'll especially come up when you can take people unawares, right? So you can be in a 1v1 fight, and then someone can move to start a new fight with another one of your fighters. And you can essentially teleport so that you're now in combat with the first fighter in the 1v1. So now you just don't fight the person who's trying to fight you, and you both take down this 2v1, sort of depending on how the positioning goes. So you can kind of, it's going to be less about the current round, but you can set up good team fights for later rounds, because a lot of missions devolve into team fights. where kind of people are going to be forced to move within 3 inches of you, and so you can just kind of dance around. It'll especially be good when someone's moving into combat with another fighter, the one that's not making the reaction, but you're still within 3 inches, because remember, 3 inches on a Warcry board is really big. And so you'll be able to kind of manipulate team fights for the next round really, really well, if you're, say, doing this in round 2, planning for a big fight in round 3. It is going to be really skill intensive, though. If you're, you know, having a few drinks while you play, you might be happier just ignoring this reaction, to be honest. But for people who like to get really, really in the weeds with what they're doing, I think the Nighthaunt reaction is going to be really rewarding from like a play skill standpoint for them. Ability changes, only a couple changes. Beheading Strike was just nixed right out of their ability list, which is fine. It was awful, so who cares. Unholy Light was buffed. It's still not very good, but now it heals D3 instead of 1 to everyone in range. So before, like, you could basically just forget that it existed. Now there might be situations, especially like I said before, Nighthaunt really cares about team fights. You might be able to use it in a team fight if you want to, if you're going to get like several different targets, maybe healing D3 4 times or healing D3 5 times. Might actually be kind of worthwhile or worth your time. But let's get into the profiles. This is what I'm really excited about. So Nighthaunt is a completely different faction now. If you see here, the profile delta is what I'm using to describe. I'm just going to show if the points went up or down, if the profile is stronger or weaker than it was before, and for the most part, you'll see most of these profiles are different. They came in and went +1 move, -1 toughness for just about everything that was toughness 5, move 5. So now the default profile for Nighthaunt, unless stated otherwise, is going to be move 6, toughness 4, which is just going to completely change how this faction plays. It's going to be a run and gun faction, basically. It's going to be a faction that's all about the speed. You'll see that points went down across the board on Nighthaunt. Now, points went down for a lot of factions, as you'll see, but for Nighthaunt, some of the point differentials are massive. So again, you're going to be able to put a lot more bodies on the board, although your cheapest fighter did go up in the chain rasp, but in general, you're going to be putting a lot more fighters on the board, and they're going to be moving a lot faster. One, I think, kind of interesting pick here is the Dreadblade Harrow. Now, it stayed the same in terms of points cost, but it got +1 attack. Now, it is -1 toughness, so it's a little easier to take down, but the additional attack on the Dreadblade Harrow makes it a real damage scary piece, and for only 235 points, especially with the Knight of Shrouds on Steed going up to 270. Now, that was the best fighter in the faction, but the Dreadblade Harrow, I think, is now the #1 piece in the faction. I think getting on that flying horse and just going wherever you want. You've got the teleport and you've got 10-inch move. They sell these in a 2-pack, easy-to-build kit, and I think right now that's basically start collecting Nighthaunt for Warcry. I think I wouldn't leave home without a minimum of 1 of these, and just that speed and the new extra damage that it's got, I think is just going to be a totally different world for any kind of Dreadblade Harrow player. I also think the Dreadscythe Harridan, it only went down 1 toughness, and it went down 35 points. I think that that's a great deal, and 105 is something that's, you know, pretty easy to play quite a few of them, so I think I would I'd be most interested in the Dreadscythe Harridan as far as troops go to fill out my lists. Now, that does prevent Nighthaunt from being able to kind of spam at all. They're not going to be kind of a swarm list, but you know, I think with Dreadscythe Harridans and Dreadblade Harrows, I think Nighthaunt is definitely in a better spot than they were before, and I think it's going to require real testing to see exactly how they play now, whether this extra movement across the board or whether, you know, the lack of toughness is going to hurt them. yeah, I think there's just a lot to test with Nighthaunt. So now I want to talk about Ossiarch Bonereapers. They have a reaction. It's called Deadly Prowess. After they're targeted by a melee attack, but before the hit rolls are made, if the attack whiffs completely, you just deal 5 damage. 5 is a lot. How often are attacks going to whiff completely, I think, is a big question. First, I want to talk about this. You'll see in the profiles, Mortek Guard are still toughness 5, and they're really cheap. And if the opponent has lots of attacks, counter is going to be better than this. You're probably going to miss on Deathly Prowess a lot. But if the opponent just has 2 or 3 Strength 4 attacks, there's a really good chance that Deathly Prowess is going to be pretty good for you. And mono reaction control with Mortek Guard is going to be a thing. Because now Deathly Prowess lets you really punish high attack fighters with counter and really punish low attack fighters with Deathly Prowess. And so just putting Mortek Guard all over the board and just reacting in later rounds is going to be really difficult to deal with, and kind of a fun new playstyle. I think if you want to showcase the new mechanics, I think that going all in with Mortek Guard is definitely something you can do. When I saw the first PDF, the Order PDF, I was really interested in sort of Fire Slayers dancing around with their reaction, and using that to kind of play a sort of chaff control game, kind of dweeb control. I think Ossiarch Bonereapers has even more exciting possibilities for that. So let's get right into their profiles. First of all, like I mentioned before, holy Mortek, right? Mortek are more powerful than they were before. They have +1 crit, and they cost 15 fewer points. So for 55 points, you can put, now they are move 3, but for 55 points, you can put all these shield Mortek on the board and sort of flood your opponent with just incredible reaction power. You can also do the two-handed Mortek for 50 points. Now, those ones did get quite a bit weaker in their profile. I'm not saying they're worse point for point, right? They're just a completely different fighter now. So they have to be evaluated completely differently. So if you're an Ossiarch Bonereaper player, make sure that you take a look at that. One other thing to note, this is the first time in Death where it's relevant, but it's been true throughout the changes. Wizards with middling abilities and garbage profiles now have middling abilities and middling profiles. So that's actually pretty exciting for casual play. Things like the Mortisan Soul Mason has always had a really interesting ability, but at 200 points for that awful fighting profile, you would just never play it, right? But down 35 points is a lot. So at 165, I'd be willing to try that. The other one, the one that combos really well with it is the Immortus Guard. And that also went down a lot, 25 points. Now, Immortus Guard were awful in the previous edition. Their profile is very similar. It's not really better or worse. It's just similar. And so, you know, Soul Mason plus Immortus Guard, I think that that's a really interesting kind of casual combo list. I don't think it'll be as powerful as Mortek, but I think it'll be playable. Stalkers have gotten a little bit weaker, just fewer wounds, but they also went down in points, so I think that that trade-off is worth it, and I think especially the one with the great swords, you know, that one comes really close internal balance-wise to being closer to the Stalker with 4 swords. Now, Morghast, though, are really interesting. So they've pumped up the ones, you know, with the Spirit Swords. They've pumped up the Spirit Halberds quite a bit. So they've made all the Morghasts just much more powerful than they were before. And then they've boosted their points up to match. I think verisimilitude-wise, I think that's what they're going for. They want them to play the way they look. Morghasts are huge, right? So I think they wanted them to be really impressive on the board. So now they are true dragon pieces. If you want to play with Ossiarch, you know, the move 8 flyers, they do incredible output. I think you're just going to be really impressed with how one Morghast can just make the entire game revolve around it. You can do sort of cheap leaders, a Morghast, and then a ton of Mortek, and kind of that's your list right there. Ossiarch were kind of in a bad place in the first edition. The only thing you could really do was an elite build with Stalkers. Those elite builds are still there. You can still play them, and they're still playable. But now you have this whole new world of you can either try to abuse the ally mechanic by just supercharging Mortex. You can do kind of a classic Dragon plus Chaff build with your Morghasts. You can try to do some kind of wizard combo builds. You can do all sorts of stuff, and I think that's really exciting. So let's get into Soulblight Gravelords. Unfeeling Flesh is the reaction. When they're targeted in melee but before hit rolls, it's just -1 damage from hits. This is reasonably useful on Toughness 3 fighters. Is it better than counter? Pretty rarely. We see a few of these kind of reducing incoming damage reactions, and they've kind of tinkered with it in a few different ways. It's really like counter is amazing when you either you have a bad attack, so counter actually out damages your attack profile, or you just know that you're not going to survive. These abilities like Unfeeling Flesh are good when you aren't sure if you're going to survive and you really want to. So like if you're holding treasure and they're attacking a treasure carrier and you just really need to hold out until help can arrive, because you know, if they take you out, the extra damage you did with counter, it's not going to matter at all, right, in a treasure mission. Same with hunter missions, right? There's a lot of situations in Warcry where you just need to kill one thing, and that's going to really matter here. So it's going to be good in those situations. Is it going to be something you use in every mission? No. In some missions, it's going to feel really powerful. It also, just remember, it doesn't hit crits, so just think about that when you're kind of planning who to use it against, right? Like a fighter that attacks you 4 times on 1s and 4s, this isn't going to do anything at all to them, so just remember that. As far as how Soulblight's profiles are changing, 1.0 competitive lists are basically still intact with no changes. You lose some points on your Vargoyle and your Virkos Bloodborne, but you gain it all back on Graveguards and Zombies. Also, I think the Necromancer, because it went down 5 points, still has roughly the same profile. Van Hel's Dance Macabre is unchanged. It's potentially less of a trap now. I think something we saw in Adepticon was that the Vargoyle but no Necromancer Soulblight lists were generally outperforming the Necromancer Soulblight lists. I think most people were leaning towards Necromancers. I was always more Vargoyle because I just think, you know, points efficiency, dragons, and damage. But, you know, people swear by the Van Hel's Dance Macabre. I think that this is a pretty big buff to that Necromancer type playstyle with Soulblight. And the reason for that is because I've been burying the lead here. Graveguard are 65 points now. Zombies and skeletons zombies and skeletons are 40 points now. They're coming. 65 point Graveguard are coming for you. They are going to burn down all your houses. They are going to chop up all your friends. There's no way to hide. Graveguard are simply just overwhelming damage potential now, coming out of Soulblight Gravelords. And I think that the Necromancer, the ability to supercharge that, I think has sort of gone up in value. Now, you still might test and find that you still want a Vargoyle in your lists. The amount of help that it was giving to Soulblight before is, you know, incredibly substantial. But you could easily go Vargoyle, Necromancer, and say a Flesh Eater Court's ally, and still just flood the board with Graveguard and Skeleton. I keep wanting to say Skellingtons and stopping myself at the last second. And you know, that list kind of builds itself. You can also just go straight with your 1.0 lists. I would say Soulblight Gravelords is an early candidate right now for best faction in the game. 40 point skeletons is absurd, and like I said before, the just wall of damage that is going to come from 65 point Graveguard, you are not ready for it. I guarantee you are not ready for it. So, SBG players rejoice. I think this faction is definitely one to watch. All right, Flesh Eater Courts. Flesh Eater Courts kind of serve the role in the Death Grand Alliance as sort of the lubricant, the straw that stirs the drink, but you can play them in their own right too. So they have Baffling Parley. It's a lot like the Soulblight Gravelords one. When they're targeted in melee before hit rolls, -1 attack. I think that this one's actually better than the SBG one. When you're borderline on surviving, it's going to be significantly better than counter, same as the SBG. This one's pretty boring, but I think it's more useful than the other one is because it's going to work on every fighter. And, you know, there's some fighters out there, some like elite, sort of Titan-y type fighters that if you get -1 attack on them, that actually does like significant damage to their profile and makes them, right, like these 3-6 fighters or these 4-8 fighters. Going -1 attack on them just like completely changes the game in terms of what they can do to you. And so Baffling Parley on ghouls is going to be pretty good in that situation. Some changes to their abilities. Terrifying Frenzy, which is the Vargolf one, it just adds 3 instead of half a dice roll, so it's much better now. Chosen of the King was nerfed. It only works with Abhorrent Archregents and Ghoul Kings. It used to work with any leader, including allies. They clearly just changed this because of the changes to the ally mechanic. That's okay. You can still make Chosen of the King lists, and I still think, if anything, it's actually a more attractive way to play than it was before. And I'll show you with the profile changes. There was just kind of a minor nerf bat all around with Soulblight Gravelords. The points changes also went down, so it doesn't hurt too much, but it's just worth looking at. All their people, you know, went down a few wounds. Some of them, though, also went down in other things too, like their attack profiles got a little bit worse. So especially the ones that people were playing a lot. So the Haunters, the Infernals, the Courtiers of those, all got significantly weaker, but then did go down in points a fair amount. And then, you know, the Flare and Horror ones, for Horrors, I'll happily take -5 points for just 1 less wound. For Flayers, I'll happily take 5 less points for 2 less wounds. I mean, that I'm less excited about, but it's still a fine trade. So the first edition lists are still there, but they're just going to pack a significantly less punch than they did before. Mostly because you were perfectly at 1,000 points before. Now you can run, you know, 980 points and have the same list, but just have less power in your top end, which I think makes it not worth it. I think it makes it so that you want to experiment. There's still powerful things you can do in Soulblight Gravelords. Your dragons are still dragons, right? The Infernal Courtier, even though it's much weaker now, 15 points cheaper, and it's still like a big scary dragon that's going to make the whole game revolve around it. So you can still get a lot of traction out of that fighter, but I think that you might want to change what you support it with. Also, the Vargolf, it got +1 range for some reason, but also significantly the ability just got way, way better. So even though it went up 20 points, I think it's worth considering. So a lot of kind of dex shuffling on the Flesh Eater Courts train, but if what you've got is a 1.0 list, you're probably, it's going to be rare that you really notice the difference in a way that feels like you've been just slapped around. I think for the most part, Flesh Eater Courts, you're still going to be able to play them the way you did before. It's just that, you know, if you're trying to min-max them, I think that the meta list for Flesh Eater Courts has changed, but you can still play whatever you did before. Ghouls are the same as they were before. That was your backbone of your list regardless, so I think you're going to be okay. Flesh Eater Courts is one of my warbands. I really love them. Unfortunately, I'm missing a lot of the good new options, so I'll probably start by testing an Abhorrent Archregent, a Ghast, which is the leader of the ghouls, a Flare, and 8 ghouls. I also might try some proxies to try a Chosen of the King list, but there's a good chance that I end up just using my leaders, my Infernal Courtier, my Crypt Ghast, and my Abhorrent Archregent as allies for other Death Warbands. I'll probably try and go get into a second Death Warband here to kind of make the most out of my Flesh Eater Courts that I love, because I just love this paint scheme, and it would be too bad if I didn't get to try it out. So, for example, I think a lot of my Flesh Eater Courts leaders right now might be really good in Ossiarch Bonereaper lists, so I might try that out. And the reason I'm talking about this is because Flesh Eater Courts has a triple that adds the full value of the dice to the movement of all your friendly fighters from where you popped this ability. It's really amazing. It's probably the best movement in the game now, because if I'm remembering right, it goes by where you popped the ability, and it does the full value of the dice. Really incredible, can just really change the sort of entire the entire dynamic of how a certain deployment group functions. And Flesh Eater Courts still has some really solid heroes. The Abhorrent Archregent, took some health issues, but is still pretty reasonably costed and moves 5. These cheap ghoul heroes, I think, are great sort of platforms to have that ability on. And then, of course, the Archregent has its sort of area-wide damage buff, so I think that that's really valuable too. So Flesh Eater Courts, still very playable, pretty solid on their own, but as allies are going to be just really nuts. So sort of that's the story with everything that changed in Death. You can see kind of a lot of changes with sort of the slower move 3 Ossiarch, just a total reshuffling of what it even means to be a Nighthaunt player. And then, I wonder if some of the nerf bats that hit the Flesh Eater Courts leaders, I think it's possible some of those were done with the ally mechanic in mind. I really wish they hadn't increased the ally mechanic. I think it's done some damage to the game, but I think that there's opportunity, if we can just be philosophical about it, there's opportunity to have a lot of fun with creating ally combos and just living in that world for a little while, for a couple years until they, decide to tweak it. So I'm going to be out with more of these videos. We're just going to keep them coming. And so until then, may all your rolls be crits.